reading now from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 24. The context of chapter 24 of Matthew has to be seen in light of the previous chapter. In chapter 23, he confronted the scribes and Pharisees, and he pronounced woe upon them. And then he said, all the judgment for all the blood shed upon the earth, in verse 35 of chapter 23. All the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. All these things shall come upon this generation. And then Jesus left the temple, and he said, your house is left to you desolate. The disciples came to him in chapter 24, and they said to him, look at all the buildings of the temple. In verse 2 of chapter 24, Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? Now, when they said, when shall these things be, they mean the things he just said. When not one stone is left upon another, and the entire temple will be thrown down. Now, looking back at it in history, we know when those things were. Those things were in 70 A.D., when Vespasian, the Roman general, came and to put down the Jewish rebellion. And interestingly enough, we'll talk about this more when we come to the idea of the Great Tribulation. The book of Revelation tells us that the Great Tribulation lasts for 3.5 years. It's told to us in terms of days, and in months, and in years. We're given it in all kinds of different forms in the book of Revelation. It's interesting for me to point out to you that the Jewish rebellion that was culminated by the destruction of the temple Jesus is predicting here began in 66 A.D. and it lasted for 3.5 years. It began in the middle of 66 A.D. and it culminated in 70 A.D. 3.5 years. Now, do you think it's any accident that period of trouble and rebellion, which prompted the Romans to come and tear down the temple, which was predicted by Jesus, do you think it's any accident that lasted for 3.5 years? The exact period of time described in the book of Revelation as the time commonly associated with the Great Tribulation. I don't think it's any accident at all. I think it fits perfectly with everything else that we've seen in the Scripture. Jesus ties everything he's saying in Matthew 24 to that generation that is living right then. Now let's go on and read a little more here. He said, do you not see these things? Not one stone will be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as they sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? The things he just talked about. And they said, what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world? Or more literally, the end of the age. Now we'll talk about this idea, this phrase, the sign of thy coming. We'll talk about that in the future. So let's set that aside for now. But all those things are linked. They're all tied together. They're all tied to, for our purposes, a very fortunate thing. They're tied to an historical fact that we can look back at and say, we know when the temple was destroyed. And he ties everything he's talking about to that event. And notice also, he ties it to the generation that is then living. Back in chapter 23, he said, all these things shall come upon this generation. And back in, that's verse 36, verse 35, he said, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth. Now, for a person to take the idea of the judgment described in Matthew 23 and 24 and take it out of that context and apply it to the modern day in which we live, it does great violence to the Scriptures. It cannot be done. Jesus is specifically and unequivocally tying what he's about to say to the generation that is then living. What's so significant about the generation then living? Well, that is the generation who saw the arrival of the last messenger of the Old Covenant. His name is Jesus. The prophets who came before, there was a long string of prophets and other messengers sent to the nation of Israel. And finally Jesus comes. Last of all, he told in the parable of the vineyard. Last of all, the householder sent his son to the husbandman in the parable of the vineyard. Now they said, tell us when these things shall be. Verse 4. Jesus answered and said, take heed that no man deceive you. When he says you, he doesn't mean us. He means you, the people he's talking to. Please understand that Jesus did not say the things he's about to say with the idea in mind of people living 2,000 years in the future. Did you know that in the Gospels, Jesus never told anybody to write anything down? If Jesus would have had in mind people living 2,000 years in the future, this would have been a good opportunity for him to say, listen guys, you're all going to be dead and gone, but 2,000 years from now, people you've never heard of in a time you can't imagine, they're going to need to know all this, so write it all down so they'll have the information. He never told them to write anything down. Now, we're fortunate that they did, but he's addressing them. He's addressing Peter, James, and John, and the other disciples, and he says, take heed that no man deceive you. The you in that verse is Peter, James, and John, and the other disciples, who ask, when shall these things be? For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And you, meaning those disciples he was addressing at that time, you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled. He doesn't mean us. He doesn't mean anyone other than those you he's talking to. See that you be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Now, you have probably heard those verses quoted and read and applied to the day in which we live. And people who want to make a point of it will say, look around. Don't you see the wars? Don't you see the famines? Don't you see the pestilences? These are the signs of the times that Jesus predicted in Matthew chapter 24. I would only stop for just a moment and point out to you what should be a self-evident fact, but because nobody reads anymore and no one knows anything about history very much, I think people just live in an isolated bubble and don't know anything prior to what happened in their own lifetime. Listen, there have been wars and pestilences and famines since the beginning of time. There has never been a time in history when there have not been wars. There has never been a time in history when there have not been famines. There have never been a time in history when there have not been pestilences. Well, someone would say, yes, but they've never been as bad as they are today. That only shows that a person who says that has never read history. There certainly have been times when they have been much worse than what we experience today. You can read about the 14th century and the Black Death, the Great Plague that came and killed a quarter of Europe's population. That was much worse than anything we have ever experienced. And you know what they said? That must be a sign of the end times. You know, people have been saying this and misapplying these verses. When Jesus said, you will see these things come to pass, take heed to yourselves that you be not deceived, see that you be not troubled, he is not talking to anyone other than the people who he's addressing. If Jesus had in mind people living 2,000 years afterwards, he's playing a cruel hoax on the people he's talking to. He should have just said to them, just relax, it's not going to happen to you, it's going to be in the future. But when he said to them, you shall see these things come to pass, he meant to prepare them for what they would see coming to pass. And do you know why he said it to them? Because he had in mind for them to escape all of those things. Now let me read you something. I want to read you this passage from the Message translation. I'm a big fan of the Message, and I was delighted to see how Eugene H. Peterson in the Message translation translated these verses, and he made the point that I'm attempting to make to you also. Let me read this about the wars and the rumors of wars. Let's see now. That is... Jesus said, watch out for doomsday deceivers. That's pretty good advice right there. Many leaders are going to show up with forged identities, claiming, I am Christ, the Messiah. They will deceive a lot of people. When reports come in of wars and rumored wars, keep your head and don't panic. This is routine history. This is no sign of the end. Nation will fight nation. Ruler will fight ruler over and over. Famines and earthquakes will occur in various places. This is nothing compared to what's coming. Did you notice that he says in this Message translation, this is just routine history. This is no sign of the end. Did you know that is the exact fact? Rumors of wars and pestilences and plagues and all of those kinds of things. Nothing special about that. That's just routine history. The larger point that I'd like to make from this is Jesus is talking not through his disciples to another generation. He specifically is talking to the generation then living, those people who are standing right in front of his face. He is speaking to Peter and James and John and the disciples of Jesus, because Jesus is going to go to the cross in just a few days, and he's going to be resurrected, and he's going to go to sit at the right hand of God. But those disciples of his, Peter, James, and John, many of them are going to be alive to see all of these events come to pass. And guess what? He said, you are going to see these things come to pass. Let's read just a little bit more. All these things are the beginning of sorrows. Then shall they deliver you to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Who is the you that he's talking about? Not people 2,000 years in the future. He's talking, when he says you, he means the people that he's addressing. Peter, James, and John. And did you know, you can read in the book of Acts and see the fulfillment of everything he said here. They were hated for his name's sake. They were killed. They were afflicted.